Hey everyone, I hope you're all doing well. As we all know, Baldur's Gate 3 is an absolutely massive game, but despite that, like any other game of this scope, there are many things that were cut from the final release. Today, I wanted to discuss some of this cut content with you, and whether this could have been added to the game overall, or if Larian made the right decision in removing it from the final release. Just quickly, all my sources are in the description if you are interested in looking further into these. Also, if you enjoy this type of content, please consider subbing to the channel and dropping a like, and without further ado, let's get right into it. Okay, the first cut piece of content from the game is surrounding the Nautiloid, in which the game was originally supposed to have a sort of tutorial zone, much larger than what we get in the final release on the Nautiloid. This content was actually in the game's early access, but of course was removed from the final release. What this cut zone was supposed to contain was multiple cutscenes, dialogue, areas, and an optional fight with 2 injured imps. This zone also included an expanded upper deck to explore and become accustomed to the game's controls and systems before further venturing into Faerun. There's no real reason as to why these were cut from the full release of the game, but it's easy to assume that it was simply removed for the sake of making the pacing better, especially as the game is already an 80+ hour mammoth. I honestly agree with Larian's decision to remove this, as although more content would have been awesome, the game is definitely a long one, and I think the super fast paced nature of the game's first 30 minutes is a great first impression of what's to come further into the game. I personally think that in terms of narrative pacing, cutting this zone was a brilliant move, and only ended up in the benefit of the game's initial tutorial section. However, if you are interested in seeing what this zone has to offer, there are mods like Darth Wren's Cut Content Restored mod, which will allow you to explore this cut zone completely, so definitely give it a go if you are interested. This one's one of the most interesting ones among the list, and definitely one I think that most of us can agree is a shame that it got cut from the final release. In the early access of Baldur's Gate 3, players were able to select Shar as a deity, which came with its own unique dialogue trees, of course creating new dialogue opportunities with Shadowheart in particular. Being a fellow Shar worshipper alongside Shadowheart would have definitely been amazing to see, and could have created an entire new branch of her arc that would have been awesome. Voice lines were data mined, indicating that this Shar deity option had functions well into Act 2 of the game, but as we all know, was eventually cut from the final release of the game. I think this one's definitely one that should have been kept in the game in some form, as although I believe Shadowheart already has the most interesting and well-written character arc among the game's companions, having the ability to also be a Shar worshipper alongside her would have created a new story arc that would have been even more compelling. Just imagine that instead of just Shadowheart coming to the light in the form of once again worshipping Selune through your convincing, that this was instead a two-way process of both the player and Shadowheart coming to the realization together. To me, that sounds fantastic, and I'm not sure why they would have thought cutting it was a great idea, other than the obvious notion of running out of dev time. Anyway, it's definitely another thing that I hope modders are able to eventually restore in some capacity, as it's without a doubt one of the most compelling pieces of cut content I would have loved to see in the game's full release. Now, the Dark Urge is already super interesting in and of itself as an origin character, but what sounds even more interesting is the fact that originally all Tavs were supposed to be the Dark Urge origin. Okay, so rewinding for a second, when the game first released, a lot of people were surprised to see the addition of the Dark Urge origin as a sort of evil or Bhaal spawn option that was noticeably missing from the game's character creation in early access. However, it turns out that the Tav we can all create that's pretty much our own slate was supposed to originally be the Dark Urge, and that they were all one origin instead of being separated like we have in the game today. This means that Tav was supposed to also be a Bhaal spawn, and we can assume that in separating the two is what caused the game's narrative divide between the Dead 3 storyline that's there much more subtly and the plot with the Mind Flayer. So now this one's definitely a peculiar one because there's two ways to look at it. In the version we have today, I think the separation of Tav and the Dark Urge has created more replayability, as most players will first play as a Tav and then the Dark Urge, and there's more than enough differences between the two in order to justify a full replay as one or the other. However, at the same time, I can definitely see the benefits in Tav also being a Dark Urge. Most particularly, I think this would have been prevalent in regard to the game's narrative, as again, if they weren't split, the story might have been a little more focused, especially in the game's third act, as the story wouldn't have to splinter depending on whether you were Tav or a Dark Urge. I'd love to hear what you all think about this cut content as well down below. This is another one of those cut content pieces that I think they definitely could have adapted and kept in the game in some form. This cut content is in relation to a character named Daisy, who was cut from the game after the last early access release and then replaced with the Dream Guardian character that we know today. Originally, Daisy was supposed to be the representative of the tadpole in your head instead of the Emperor, and very interestingly would attempt to seduce your character into staying in the meadow by the river with her forever. This would essentially mean an imaginary happy life with a fake lover while your body underwent underwent complete transformation and was lost forever. And this cut content is not like the others on this list. Its impact can still be felt in the game even in the final release. Daisy was so important to the game's overall plot that both of the game's main theme songs, Down by the River and The Power, are based entirely upon the concept of Daisy's place in the story. In addition to that, data mine content also shows that there was originally an ending in the game where players would be able to enter a romance with Daisy and give themselves over to the parasite, forever leaving their own autonomy down by the river with Daisy. Now, I don't know about you, but in learning about this, it sounds like an incredible idea that I'm sad never made it into the game. I don't think it's something that would have been able to not coexist in some way with what we got, and I think some form of this, especially that ending, should have been included in the game's final release. And again, I hope it's something that cut content mods will be able to restore in full. Minsc is a character from the original Baldur's Gate games, just like Jaheira, and so seeing that he was only in Act 3 and even then just for a short time was actually a little bit disappointing. However, according to some data mine information, Minsc was actually meant to be recruited all the way at the end of Act 1 instead, but this idea was cut and his recruitment was pushed back into the late game. We don't know much else about what this would have entailed beyond that, but honestly, this is another one of the cut things I wish actually stayed in the game. We already get Jaheira quite late too, being able to recruit her into our party at the end of Act 2, and the fact that Minsc is recruited so much later in Act 3 made me really not connect with his character at all. I think if his character was recruited in Act 1 or even in the midst of Act 2, it would make me appreciate his character much more, especially as someone who hasn't finished the original 2 Baldur's Gate games. Although it was pretty cool seeing Jaheira talk about him in Act 3 and then recruiting him, I think the opposite would have worked great as well, where we'd recruit Minsc in Act 1 and then allow him and Jaheira to reunite in the Last Light Inn in Act 2. This would have definitely given more supple time for the two to become further reacquainted and for us to learn more about both characters from Act 2 onwards, and possibly having even more fleshed out character quests for both of them in Act 3 of the game. What if I told you that an entire dramatic fight including both Bhaal's forces led by Orin versus the Githyanki was cut entirely from the game? I think you, just like me, would be pretty bummed out that this didn't actually make it into the final release of the game. Okay, so according to some more data mine information, apparently an entire Act 2 battle was cut from the game. This fight would see Bhaal's forces led by Orin attacking the Githyanki Kresh, which would lead to a fight where you'd have to side with one or the other, or have a massive three-way fight against both forces. I don't know about you, but this sounds amazing, and I think would have definitely helped the game's ability to flesh out the Dead 3 a little bit more, instead of introducing them properly so far into the game at the end of Act 2. It for sure would have made the threat of the Dead 3 and their chosen much more plausible, with them having eyes on all of Faerun instead of just sticking to their places in the city of Baldur's Gate, or in the case of Ketheric, the Shadow-Cursed lands. The Dead 3 are always explained in the game to be an unstoppable force, especially through the help of their wicked chosen, but other than the pretty easy fights against the chosen of each, they don't really feel like that big of a threat. Having a sequence like this and the choice to choose which side to team with could have also possibly created another branch in the story that leaned more, again, into a cleaner Dead 3 storyline than what we got in the final product. Let me know what you think about this down below. Do you think it should have been kept in the game? And if so, why? You may have noticed that when accepting Auntie Ethel's help during the early stages of Act 1, they will get a negative effect on your character, specifically in fighting hags. However, you would have also realized once you finish the game that despite Auntie Ethel having letters from other hags in her basement, that she's actually the only one you encounter within the game. Well, originally there was supposed to be a full 3-act spanning story including the Hag Coven, including the mysterious hag named M, who seems to have been their leader. Again, I know I sound like a broken record in this video, but this is another one of the things I wish would have made it into the game's final release. Auntie Ethel's story already is pretty interesting, from its start in Act 1 and its end in Act 3, but to have a quest including a sort of hag council with multiple hags and characters included would have made for an awesome quest. I already kind of wish that Auntie Ethel was present in Act 2 as well, so we could have had a quest that spanned in some shape or form across all 3 acts. To have numerous hags with their own motives, powers, and dangerous abilities could have made for some incredible fights and dialogue exchanges. Maybe you could even side with the hags within this quest, and this would have led to a greater conflict across the game with those trying to hunt down the hags, such as Mayrina and her band of people in Act 3. There's quite a few cut areas from the game, but this one and another one we'll discuss in a later section would have added to the game's lore and scope in massive ways. Avernus is an area we see a glimpse of at both the very start of the game in the opening cutscene and at the end of Act 3 if you get the ending with Karlach where she and Will go into Avernus so her heart doesn't kill her. Just from these 2 glimpses of the fiery place, we can already tell that it would be an amazing place to explore and look around in, and would make for a zone that is so unique and different from anything else that's already in the game. Well, well, originally Avernus was supposed to be an area that was fully explorable and of similar size to the already large Underdark area of Act 1. Avernus would not only be a source for more soul coins and other rare materials only found in the Hells, but it would have provided us with some new highly difficult fights and of course some special content surrounding Karlach. In the actual game, the only true area we get to explore that gives off the vibes of hellish landscapes and devilish desires is the House of Hope, and for me personally, it's my favorite area in the entire game. So to know that we could have got an entire area of essentially hell to explore and get a further fleshing out of Karlach's, and I'm assuming Will's stories, would have been phenomenal. I've already said this in a couple of prior videos, but I've always felt like Karlach and Will's stories get the short end of the stick in Act 3 compared to characters like Shadowheart and Astarion, and I think this may be the reason why. Having such a zone would for sure have added a lot of nuance and depth to Karlach and Will's character arcs, and I think would have definitely helped make the arcs end on the same high note that Shadowheart has, for example. Again, I'd love to hear what you think down below, and with that, let's move on to the next entry. A crafting system is one I didn't expect to see when reading up and doing the research for this video, and I'm kind of torn on whether I actually would have liked to see this in the game or not. So essentially, an early access build of the game contained a crafting bench of sorts, and it seems that we originally were able to have full access to the ability to craft and enchant gear of our own through fleshed out crafting systems. While this was of course cut from the full release of the game, many remnants of it still remain, such as the items needed for crafting. This is the reason why items like ingots, gemstones, woods, and other material items are in the game but have no real utility other than being sold to shopkeepers across Faerun. On one hand, having a crafting system would have further expanded the depth of the gameplay in Baldur's Gate 3, which is already quite up there in terms of mechanical depth for me personally, and I think crafting our own armor and weapons would have been cool to grind for. However, I also like how the system works already, where the only real craftable items are in relation to alchemy, with weapons and armor being found through looting or simply by killing special enemies or bosses across the game. Yes, for sure, being able to craft our own weapons, armor, and accessories would have definitely added to the replayability and content of the game as a whole. But I think when the package is already as big as it is, a crafting system might have not exactly been something beneficial to the existing gameplay loop. This cut content is something that I'm guessing 95% of people that play the game already know about, because it's one that Larian themselves have spoken about in interviews and the like, and it's one that kind of feels obvious when you're playing the game for yourself. Larian talked about the affluent upper city of Baldur's Gate just 2 weeks before the game's full launch, and described it as an area that would have been fully explorable, but it's very noticeably absent from the final version. It's clear from what Larian has said that this area was cut in order to reduce the game's scope, which is already massive in itself, and because they wanted to ensure a level of consistency through every aspect of the game, and the development of this zone might have jeopardized that goal. You know, when I first played the game, I also immediately knew that something was missing when exploring Baldur's Gate for the first time. Yes, the city was massive, and the lower city and the areas preceding it were fun to explore, and there was no shortage of content to engage with and find. But despite that, I did wonder to myself why there were all these areas, but we could see larger silhouetted buildings in the distance, signifying that of course this city is much larger than what we see in the actual game. Thinking about it, it is a little funny that all of the Chosen's shenanigans and the majority of Act 3's chaotic events occur only in pretty much the lower part of the city, whereas we can assume that the upper city is where the most affluent and cunning people within the city reside. It's a shame that this area was cut from the full game, and it may have been something that they could have added if they did a DLC story, but unfortunately it doesn't seem we'll ever get to see what the upper city zone would have held. If you like Raphael as a character as much as I do, you also probably wish there was some more dialogue and content for him, as he's really one of the most fascinating characters in the entire game. With this being said, what if I told you that Raphael was actually supposed to be a sort of merchant character, with functions that would have completely changed the narrative of the entire game? Well, Raphael was actually meant to be a fully viable option to remove the tadpole for real. In fact, the game's soul coin items were supposed to originally be a powerful alternative currency only accepted by Raphael. Raphael would accept this currency in exchange for possibly retrieving your soul, in addition to a long list of incredibly powerful artifacts from the House of Hope that would actually be sold by Raphael himself. Again, this is another super cool piece of cut content that I honestly think they could have integrated in the game's full release in some form. Although I think his ability to actually remove the tadpole in your head wouldn't be viable as an option without changing major parts of the narrative, I think the part about him being a sort of merchant that gives actual utility to the soul coins in being able to access powerful items through them is an incredible incredible idea. Just imagine being able to purchase distinct hellish items from Raphael and the unique dialogue that may have come as a result of interacting with him and purchasing these items. Raphael is already such a well-written character, but this piece of cut content would have honestly turned his character into, without a doubt, one of the best characters in the entire game. And although I don't know if it's possible, hopefully modders can restore this sort of idea in some form one day. Now, our final entry is the one that I think all of us, without a doubt, wished made it into the actual release of the game. More data mine content shows that not only did Karlach have a full ending where her infernal engine was actually able to be fixed in full and that she would survive and be able to live in Faerun, but that most of it was actually already voice acted and completed. However, the problem with this was that this ending required specific triggers from the upper city portion of Baldur's Gate, and when that was cut from the game's full release, so was the happy ending Karlach ultimately deserved. The endings we actually get in the game in regard to Karlach have been confirmed to be the fail state endings, which were only meant for Karlach if the player neglected her quest chain completely. This is a really unfortunate one, and it's something that I've also complained about in several videos. Where Shadowheart, Astarion, and Lae'zel have complete arcs with happy ending variants, Karlach is just left in the dust with endings that, no matter which way you look at it, aren't happy endings at all. Arguably the best ending is of course the one where she doesn't die and takes Will or you with her to Avernus, where she can live but only with the constant attacks of the devils of Zerial trying to kill her. Karlach is one of the most well-written and complex characters in the entire game, and to think that she almost was able to have a real happy ending is pretty sad. Again, this would be a pretty mammoth task to mod in, but the fact that much of it was already voice acted and completed gives me hope that we'll be able to see remnants of this in some form, even if it is just a few voice lines of her happy ending that we never got. And with that, that's a bunch of cut content from Baldur's Gate 3. I had a lot of fun reading up and writing up this video, and if you enjoyed, please let me know down below, as I would love to make a part 2 covering even more cut content that we know of. It's a shame a lot of these were cut, but the game still ended up being fantastic even without them, and hopefully one day we'll see some of these in full through the modding community's great work and talent. Anyway, that's all from me for today's video. If you enjoyed, please consider subbing to the channel for more Baldur's Gate 3 and RPG content, and I'll see you all in the next one. Peace.